A film projector clicks and hums in a dark room. Bruce Lee's arm is already moving on the wall in front of it, a straight lead thrown from a bladed stance, so fast that most eyes need a second pass just to see where it started. And standing between the light and the wall, close enough that his shadow eats half of Bruce's projected body, a man throws that exact same punch. Same angle, same snap through the wrist. Same half-beat hitch on the retraction that nobody teaches, because nobody who isn't Bruce Lee throws it that way. He does it again, and again, a dozen times, maybe more, rewinding the reel by hand each time before he lets it run forward and just watches. He is not Bruce Lee. That much you can tell from the shadow alone, broader through the shoulders, taller by a head, a different animal wearing the same motion like it was tailored for somebody else. And he stole it off the rack anyway. Nobody in that room says his name out loud. For now, neither will I. Stay with me, because this is where it gets strange. Whoever this man is, he isn't doing this for fun. Fun doesn't rewind a punch 9 times. Fun doesn't sit alone in the dark past midnight, running black and white film until the sprockets get warm, chasing the exact millisecond where a hip turns before a fist does. This is study. This is a man trying to steal something out of another man's body, frame by frame. Like it's a locked door, and he's found a very specific key. Here's the version they tell in the back rooms of old dojos. The one that refuses to die. 2 of the most famous movers of the 20th century, a boxer and a martial artist, orbiting each other for years without ever once standing in the same room. Each convinced the other man had solved a piece of the puzzle he hadn't. One of them left behind film. The other left behind a legend about a letter. I want to tell you both stories tonight because they're the same story, really just told from opposite ends of a room that never actually got built. And I want to be straight with you before we go one step further. I don't know exactly what happened. Nobody does. Some of what's coming is close to documented fact. Some of it is the kind of thing that gets repeated in gyms until repetition starts to feel like proof, which it isn't, and which I'll never pretend it is. But the shape of it, the reason it keeps getting told 60 years on, that part is worth your time regardless of how it ends. And it doesn't end tonight. I'll tell you that up front too, because it's only fair. This is the first half of something. The second half belongs to another night, another video further down the road. Tonight is about the study, the near miss, the offer nobody expected, and the choice one man made that nobody who wasn't in the room ever fully explained. What happened to what he chose, where it went, who, if anyone ever saw it, stays a mystery by design, at least for now. Some secrets don't get cracked open in one sitting. This is one of those. Los Angeles, 1970. Late in a decade that had chewed up most of its idealism and was working on the rest. 2 men occupied that city in its wider orbit of gyms and film canisters and backlot certainties, each one already famous in his own world, each one strangely fixated on the others. One of them was already, at that point, being called the greatest that ever laced up gloves, a title he'd say himself before anyone else could, loud enough that the saying became half the proof. The other ran a small, serious martial arts school out of a converted building, teaching a system he'd built by taking apart every other system he could get his hands on and keeping only the parts that actually worked when someone was trying to hurt you. Neither man had met the other. Neither man, as far as anyone can actually confirm, had exchanged so much as a letter at this point. And yet here's a projector running in a dark room, throwing one of them onto a wall while the other studies him like scripture. That's the myth doing its work already, and we're not even 5 minutes in. So let's rewind the actual reel, the way that man in the dark room kept rewinding his. Let's go back to how the 2 of them got interested in each other in the first place, because that part, unlike the letter, unlike the meeting that never quite happened, is closer to something you can actually stand on. And it starts, appropriately enough, with a much smaller, much less mythical room than the one you're picturing. A year or so before that projector ever clicked on, there's a smaller room to picture instead. Chinatown, Los Angeles, a converted commercial space with mirrors on one wall and a heavy bag hanging still in the corner because nobody's using it today. This is Bruce Lee's school, if you can call it a school. It doesn't have a name over the door that means much to anyone outside it yet. Inside, there's a shelf of film canisters that Bruce treats the way other men treat a gun cabinet. Organized, cleaned, guarded. Bruce watches film the way most people watch weather. Compulsively, looking for the thing that's about to change. He's got fight reels of dozens of boxers, wrestlers, fencers, street brawls shot on grainy stock nobody remembers the source of anymore. But there's one boxer's reel that gets more wear on the sprockets than all the others combined. Run back so many times the picture starts to flicker and skip in the same 3 places every time. You already know whose. Here's what gets me about this part of the story, before we even get to the stranger half of it. Bruce wasn't watching boxing for the punches. Punches he had plenty of, better than plenty. He was watching for the spaces between punches, for the way a heavyweight built like a battleship somehow moved his feet like he weighed nothing at all, angling off a jab, resetting distance, making 6 inches of retreat look like an insult to the man throwing at him. That a different kind of violence, the kind that happens before the hitting starts, and Bruce, obsessive student that he was, wanted the blueprint. Now, cut back to that dark room with the projector because it's time to stop being coy about who's standing in it. The man rewinding Bruce Lee's film, throwing Bruce's own lead hand back and imaginary Bruce lead 12 times in a row until his shoulder found the groove, was Muhammad Ali. Say it slow if you need a second. I did the first time I heard this story told properly by an old corner man who swore up and down he wasn't in the room himself, but knew a man who was, which, fair warning, is exactly the kind of second-hand claim I promised you at the start I wouldn't pretend was proof. It isn't. But the shape of the claim, the idea that Ali, of all people, the loudest, most self-certain fighter alive, would spend a quiet hour alone studying a smaller man from an entirely different sport. That part has legs because it fits everything else we actually know about how Ali's mind worked. Ali didn't study opponents the way other fighters did. He studied ideas. He'd spent years absorbing whatever moved beautifully and made it his magpie style without a shred of embarrassment about where it came from. Dance steps, church rhythm, the particular balance of a jump rope. If a 5'7" martial artist from Hong Kong by way of Seattle had found a way to close distance faster than physics seemed to allow, Ali, the story insists, wanted that filed away too. Not to fight the man, just to own the motion the way he owned everything else he ever looked at twice. Did Ali actually sit alone with Bruce Lee's footage the way this story has him doing? Almost certainly not with this much ceremony. Not with a projector clicking away past midnight, like something out of a detective film. But stay with me, because somewhere underneath the theater of it, there's a much quieter, much more plausible truth. 2 men who moved better than almost anyone alive, each one aware, in whatever way famous people become aware of each other, that the other existed. Fighters notice fighters, even fighters from different sports, especially those. You already know where this goes, at least in outline. A boxer half-legend and a martial artist half-legend, each one quietly convinced the other had found something worth stealing. Neither one saying it out loud yet. Neither one, at this point, even sure the feeling ran both directions. It did, though, or so the story goes. And the proof, such as it is, isn't in anything Ali left behind. It's in what happened next on Bruce's side of the city, in a room with mirrors on the wall and a heavy bag nobody was using yet, either. Quiet for a second. Let the room empty out. Picture Bruce alone after class, students gone home, the mirrors giving back nothing but an empty floor and one man standing in the middle of it. This is where the real, documented part of tonight's story lives, and I want to slow down for it, because it deserves better than a passing mention. Bruce Lee talked about this himself, on camera, in interviews, no legend required. He had reels of Muhammad Ali fights, and he watched them obsessively, not for the punches, but for the footwork, the angles, The way Ollie controlled range against men who outweighed nobody and still couldn't touch him. Traditional martial arts, the kind Bruce had grown up drilling and then grown disillusioned with, prized stances. Fixed, rooted, textbook beautiful stances that looked unbeatable standing still in a photograph and fell apart the instant somebody threw something unscripted at them. Boxing, by contrast, had spent 100 years getting one single problem down to a science. How do you control the 6 feet of air between two men trying to hit each other, using nothing but your feet, your hips, and the timing to know when that gap should shrink or grow? Bruce thought most martial artists had never actually solved that problem. He thought Ollie, without ever calling it a martial art, had solved it better than almost anyone he'd ever seen. So he did what he always did with anything that worked. He took it apart. He'd run a reel forward, stop it, run it back 3 frames, forward 2, back 1, hunting for the exact moment a shift in Ollie's rear foot changed the angle of everything above it. He kept a notebook for this, dense with his own shorthand, sketches of footwear patterns next to notes that read less like martial arts theory and more like an engineer's log. Distance, timing, broken rhythm. He wasn't trying to become a boxer. He wanted the principle underneath the boxing stripped out and rebuilt into something that didn't care what sport it came from, which was, if you know anything about how Bruce built Jeet can do, exactly the whole point of the thing. Here's the version of this scene people who trained under him still describe, decades on, whenever the subject of Ollie comes up. Bruce, alone or with one trusted student, running the same 3 seconds of film until the projector bulb got hot enough to smell, and then standing up without a word to try it himself. Empty room, no opponent, just his own feet finding the rhythm on the wood floor over and over, chasing a heavyweight boxer shadow with a frame that weighed maybe a third as much. That's not the legend part. That's the documented part. The part that survived in Bruce's own words and his own students' memories. Everything else, the projector, the mirrored obsession on Ali's side, all of that is the story riding on the back of this one true thing. Which is, when you think about it, how most good legends get built. Not out of nothing. Out of one real fact, wearing a much bigger coat. That's the theory, anyway. Watching film, filling a notebook, chasing an idea with your eyes half shut. Here's the practice, and the practice always looks uglier and more honest than the theory ever does. There's a training partner who shows up in this part of the story more than anyone else. A broad-shouldered young man Bruce's students remember mostly by build rather than name. The kind of detail that survives in second-hand telling when a specific name doesn't. Call him what they called him at the school. Big Wilson, on account of there being a smaller one too. Big Wilson was closer to Ali's size than anyone else training in that room, which made him, whether he liked it or not, the only living stand-in Bruce had for an idea he couldn't yet test on the real thing. The setup was simple enough to describe and miserable enough to live through. Bruce would have Big Wilson come forward behind a jab, the way a much bigger man naturally does, closing distance in a straight line, because a straight line is the shortest way to hurt somebody smaller than you. Bruce, maybe 5 inches shorter and 80 pounds lighter, wouldn't retreat straight back. He'd angled off, a step that looked almost lazy, weight rolling onto the outside foot, hips already turning before the front foot had even finished landing. That's the technique. Here's why it worked, or why it worked often enough that Bruce kept building on it. A bigger man's power lives mostly in a straight line, because that's where his mass and his reach do the most damage. Step directly back from that line, and you're still standing in the only lane he's built to travel down, just further away, buying time instead of buying safety. Step off the line at an angle instead, and suddenly his whole structure, the mass, the reach, the forward momentum he just committed to is pointed at empty air, while you've ended up somewhere near his flank with your own hands already loaded. It's the same principle Bruce watched Ollie use against heavier men for 100 feet of film. Don't outmuscle the incoming force. Relocate the fight to a spot the incoming force isn't aimed at. Big Wilson's reaction, by every account that survives, was the same reaction every training partner eventually had. First, confusion. The specific confusion of a bigger, stronger man who did everything right and still found his target gone. Then, a few repetitions later, something closer to respect mixed with genuine irritation, the particular flavor of frustration that comes from being outmaneuvered by someone your size chart says you should be able to simply walk through. People who trained at that school still argue, decades later, about how many times Bruce actually pulled this off clean in a single session, whether it was 3 times or 13. Nobody argues about the part that matters. They agree Big Wilson stopped, hands on his knees, and said, more to himself than to Bruce, that he didn't know how a man that size kept disappearing like that. And they agree Bruce didn't answer with a lecture. He just reset his stance and asked to run it again. So here's where the two halves of this story actually meet, without either man knowing it. 100 miles or more apart, on any given week that year, one man is running a heavyweights film back a dozen times to steal his feet, and the other is running that same heavyweights footwork against a stand-in half his weight class. Try to prove a smaller man's frame could survive it. Neither one has picked up a phone. Neither one has sent a word. And yet by every honest measure that matters, in the only place that counts, in the actual work, they were already in the ring together. Just nobody had told either of them the fight had started. 3 seconds. That's roughly how long the piece of film was that Ali supposedly wore out faster than any other in his collection. According to the story, at least 3 seconds of Bruce Lee closing distance on a heavy bag, hip and shoulder arriving at the same instant like they've been sent by the same signal instead of 2 separate decisions. Cross the city now to a boxing gym that smelled like liniment and old rope, and picture Ali's side of this the way the legend paints it. His own cornermen noticing him drilling something small and strange between rounds of regular work, a little shortening of his lead step, a subtle hip-first turn on the retreat that hadn't been part of his game a year earlier. One of them, so the story goes, finally asked him straight out where he'd picked it up, and Ali, never a man to undersell a good line, supposedly just grinned and said he'd been doing some studying of his own from a teacher who didn't know he was teaching. Picture the drill itself the way the legend stages it, because the specifics are worth slowing down for. A sparring partner squares up at a full arm's length, the standard boxer's measure, close enough to threaten, far enough to react. Ali doesn't retreat straight back the way the drill usually calls for. Instead, right as the partner's lead hand starts forward, Ali's rear foot turns a few degrees on the ball, his hips rotating a half second ahead of his shoulders, and he steps not back but slightly across, closing the angle from the outside rather than opening distance in a straight line. Here's why that tiny adjustment matters more than it looks like it should. A straight retreat keeps you directly in front of the same weapon, just a few inches further from it, buying time, but not safety, the same trap Bruce had spent his own sessions dismantling on the other side of the country. Turning the hip first and stepping across the line does something different entirely. It relocates you off the axis the incoming punch is actually traveling down, so the same effort that should have connected instead grazes past a shoulder that's already 3 inches from where it started, while your own lead hand, following the same rotation, arrives already loaded on the exposed side of the man who just missed you. The sparring partner's reaction, according to the story, was somewhere between confusion and mild offense. The specific frustration of a man who did the drill correctly by every rule he'd ever been taught and still came up empty, twice, then a third time, before he finally stopped and asked what exactly Ali thought he was doing differently. People who trained in that gym around this time still disagree, decades later, on how many of these sessions actually happened or how deliberate Ali was being versus simply improvising off instinct the way great athletes so often do without being able to fully explain it afterward. But they agree on this much. Whatever Ali was doing with that hip turn, it wasn't standard for a heavyweight of his era, and it wasn't there in his footage a year or two earlier. Did that exchange happen exactly like that, word for word? in a gym with a name we could point to? Almost certainly not. Nobody wrote it down at the time if it happened at all, and the version that survives has clearly been polished by 60 years of retelling until the punchline lands a little too perfectly. But here's the thing that keeps this particular rumor alive instead of letting it die like 1,000 other locker room stories. Ollie really did change, subtly, across those years, in ways sports writers at the time noted without ever explaining why. Faster resets, tighter angles on the retreat, whether that came from Bruce Lee's film or a dozen other places Ali's magpie mind had been raiding at once. Nobody can say for certain. The story just picked the most interesting possible source and ran with it, the way stories do. And maybe that's fine. Maybe that's even the point. A legend doesn't need to be the only explanation. It just needs to be the one that keeps getting told at last call, in gyms, by men who weren't there but wish they had been. Here's what gets me about this whole stretch of the story, the part before either man has done anything you could point a camera at and call proof of anything. Two of the most physically gifted human beings of their entire century, each one already more famous than most people become in a lifetime, spending quiet, unglamorous hours alone with a strip of film, try to learn from a man they'd never met. Not for money. Not for an audience. Nobody was filming Bruce in that empty practice room after class. Nobody was filming Ollie between rounds, working out a private theory nobody had asked him to test. That's not the version of these two men most people carry around in their heads. Most people remember the finished product, the certainty, the showmanship, the quotes that sound like they were carved in stone before they were ever spoken. This story is about the unfinished part, the part where both of them were still just two extremely talented men, alone in separate rooms, quietly worried the other one might already be better at the thing they'd each built their whole identity around. That worry, on Bruce's side at least, was about to get tested against something a lot more honest than a training partner standing in for a legend. It was about to get tested against arithmetic. Strip away the myth for a second, and look at this the way the skeptics around Bruce's own school looked at it, because there were plenty of them, and they weren't wrong to exist. It's easy, 60 years on, knowing how the legend gets told, to forget that a lot of people close to Bruce thought this entire comparison, Bruce Lee and Muhammad Ali, spoken in the same breath as potential opponents, was close to absurd. Not because Bruce wasn't fast, not because Bruce wasn't dangerous in ways most men in that gym had personally, painfully confirmed, but because speed and danger, past a certain point, stopped being the only variables in the equation. Ali, at his fighting weight, was carrying somewhere around 90 pounds more than Bruce, most of it distributed exactly where a boxer needs it, across a reach that outstripped Bruce's by the better part of a foot. That's not a gap you close with better footwork alone. That's a gap where the bigger man's jab alone travels through the exact distance the smaller man needs to cross just to get in a range to do anything at all, which means the smaller man is, by definition, spending part of every exchange inside someone else's punch before he can even start throwing his own. A few of Bruce's own students, the honest ones, the ones who loved him enough to say the uncomfortable thing out loud, apparently raised exactly this with him directly, whether in so many words or just in the raised eyebrow way training partners do when a conversation gets too close to a fantasy nobody wants to be the one to puncture. And here is the part of tonight's story I think matters more than any of the more dramatic ones. Bruce didn't get defensive about it. He didn't puff himself up the way the character in his films might have. By every account of the people who actually knew him off camera, Bruce Lee was almost brutally clear-eyed about physics when it came to real violence, because his entire system was built on the premise that pretending distance and mass don't matter gets people hurt. So he said it himself, plainly, more than once, in different rooms to different people over the following years whenever someone brought up the idea of him and a heavyweight boxer squaring off for real. At true heavyweight size against a man built and trained like Ali, the same tools that worked beautifully against Big Wilson in that practice room would not simply scale up and keep working. The angles that let him step off a bigger man's line depended on a gap in mass and reach that, past a certain threshold, physics itself closes back up regardless of how clever the footwork underneath it is. 6 inches of angle that gets you clear of a middleweight's power might not get you clear of a heavyweight's, because the heavyweight's punch was never traveling in quite as straight a line to begin with, and his recovery is faster than the gap would suggest. That's not humility for the cameras. Bruce wasn't performing modesty. Performing modesty wasn't really in his nature, and anyone who watched him teach knows he had no trouble telling a room exactly how good he was. This was something closer to respect, the specific, hard-won respect one serious craftsman has for a problem he studied honestly enough to know he hasn't solved. He'd spent months with Ali's footage precisely because he suspected, correctly, that there was a category of physical problem boxing had already cracked that his own art hadn't fully caught up to yet. Admitting that wasn't weakness. In a man like Bruce, it was the clearest evidence of how seriously he actually took it. Stay with me here, because it's the moment in the story where I think the audience is finally allowed to doubt the hero a little, and honestly, I think that's healthy. We build these men into something bulletproof after they're gone, especially Bruce, especially given how his story ends. But the real Bruce Lee, the one who existed before any of that, was a man doing math on his own limitations in a quiet room, same as anyone with an honest relationship to their own craft eventually has to. That's not a smaller version of the legend. If anything, it's the part that makes everything after it mean something. You've probably noticed by now that I keep circling back to this same idea, doubt as a form of respect rather than an insult to it. That's deliberate. It's the one thread running under everything else in this story, and I'd rather you catch it early than have it sneak up on you at the end. Because here's the thing about a man who's already admitted, privately, that a fight like this wouldn't work the way people wanted it to. That's exactly the kind of man who, when an actual offer for exactly that fight lands on his desk with real money attached, has absolutely nothing left to prove to himself by saying yes. But factor in what happened to both of these men over the next year or so, because neither one of them stayed still long enough for that offer to find them as the same people who'd been circling each other from a distance. Ali, not long before any of this, had spent 3.5 years exiled from the sport that made him, stripped of his title and his license for refusing to be drafted into a war he wouldn't fight, his best physical years bleeding away while lawyers argued his case through the courts. By 1970, he was fighting his way back into the ring rusty and furious. And by early 1971, he was stepping into Madison Square Garden against Joe Frazier in what the whole country was calling the fight of the century before either man had thrown a punch. He lost that one, the first defeat of his professional life, in 15 brutal rounds, and came out of it somehow more mythical rather than less, because that's what happens to certain men when they finally lose in public. The armor cracks, and people realize, with something like relief, that there was always a person inside it. Bruce, according to more than one account from people close to him, watched that Frazier fight the same way he watched everything, which is to say obsessively rewinding certain exchanges to study exactly what changed in Ali's footwork under real pressure rather than the relatively unthreatened pace of the exhibition sparring his earlier film had mostly captured. Losing, it turns out, teaches a fighter things winning never quite manages to. And if Bruce's whole education and Ali had been built on watching a man move beautifully when nothing was truly at stake, this fight handed him something raw. The same footwork, the same angles, tested against a puncher whose entire game was built to punish exactly the kind of retreat Ali preferred. What Bruce took from watching Ali lose, nobody wrote down at the time. But it's worth remembering that some of Bruce's sharpest thinking about distance and recovery, the ideas that would eventually show up distilled in his own teaching, came together in exactly this window, right after the one fight where Ali's whole approach to range finally met something it couldn't fully solve. Bruce, in that same stretch, was pulling off the opposite trajectory. Frustrated by how slowly Hollywood was willing to make room for an Asian leading man on his own terms, he'd gone back to Hong Kong and, within the space of about a year, become the biggest movie star the region had ever produced. The Big Boss, then Fist of Fury, packed theaters across Asia and started leaking into markets nobody had bothered to predict, turning a martial arts instructor with a notebook full of footwork diagrams into someone recognized on sight from Bangkok to Beirut. He was, by any reasonable measure, no longer just a serious student of Muhammad Ali's movement. He was becoming a comparable kind of phenomenon in his own right, famous for reasons that had nothing to do with who he'd once quietly studied in a darkroom. Picture the difference in scale for a second, because it matters for what comes next. 2 years earlier, Bruce Lee was a respected but modestly paid martial arts instructor and bit part actor, teaching private lessons to a short list of Hollywood clients out of a converted space most of Los Angeles had never heard of. By late 1971, crowds in Hong Kong were reportedly lining up around city blocks hours before a single screening of his films, theater managers adding extra showings just to keep pace with demand nobody had budgeted for. That kind of velocity changes how the world values a man's time, his image, and eventually his willingness to hand any part of either one over to somebody else's contract. Ali's comeback ran on a similar, if differently shaped curve. A fighter written off by the boxing establishment as finished, exiled, past his physical prime, came back from 3.5 lost years to headline the single biggest event the sport had produced in a generation. Whatever you think about how that Frazier fight ended, the sheer scale of attention it generated, worldwide broadcast rights, a live gate that dwarfed anything before it, proved something the promoters circling Bruce and Ali were watching very closely indeed. Put two names enormous enough in front of the right audience, and the money follows almost by itself, whether either man asked for it or not. Which is exactly what makes what happened next make sense, and exactly what makes it dangerous. Two men who'd spent years admiring each other for careful distance were, by 1971, each carrying enough weight of their own, enough box office, enough gate receipts, enough raw public fascination, that somebody, somewhere, was eventually going to do the math on what happened if you put both names on the same poster. Somebody did. It's the tail end of 1971 now, and this is the part of the story that finally leaves the private rooms and steps into daylight, at least according to the version that's been handed down. A consortium, the story says, some mix of fight promoters and film financiers who smelled the same opportunity from two completely different industries at almost the same moment, put together a formal approach. Not a street corner rumor this time. An actual proposal, drafted with the seriousness money gets drafted with, for a sanctioned exhibition between Muhammad Ali and Bruce Lee. Nobody involved was pretending this would be a real fight in the way Ali Frazier had been a real fight. Even the promoters, whatever else you want to say about them, weren't foolish enough to sell a full contact bout between a heavyweight boxing champion and a 140-pound movie star as anything other than what it actually was, a demonstration, part exhibition, part choreography. The two most magnetic fighting men on the planet, sharing a ring in front of cameras that would beam it to more countries than either man's own films had managed on their own. Call it an exhibition if you're being generous. Call it a spectacle if you're being honest. Either way, the number attached to it was not a spectacle number. It was real money, the kind that gets wired in installments and lawyered over for months before a single camera rolls. The figure that gets repeated most often in the retelling sits somewhere in the millions, split between the two men and the production costs around them, a number so large for 1971 that it would have made both of them, instantly, among the highest paid performers of any kind on the planet for a single night's work. Whether that exact figure is accurate or inflated by 50 years of retelling, I genuinely can't tell you. What isn't in dispute is that the offer, in whatever form it actually took, was serious enough to make its way to both camps, serious enough that people on both sides started drawing up contracts instead of just trading rumors. And for one long moment, sitting on both men's desks at once, unread or half-read, this thing the whole world apparently wanted, the thing two rival storytellers 100 years from now would still be arguing about, was suddenly almost unbearably close to real. $2.5 million. That's the figure that shows up most consistently across the different tellings of this story, whether it's accurate to the dollar or not. And I want you to sit with that number for a second the way both camps must have. In 1971, that kind of money attached to a single night's work wasn't just generous. It was the sort of number that reorganizes a man's priorities without him even noticing it happening. Which is exactly where the third party in this story shows up, and they're the least romantic figures in the whole thing, which is precisely why they matter. Neither Bruce nor Ollie, whatever their private feelings about each other, had built this offer out of thin air. A cluster of promoters had, sensing an opportunity that had nothing to do with footwork or mutual respect, and everything to do with two enormous audiences that had never once been asked to watch the same event together. Boxing fans and martial arts fans, American fight crowds, and the entire booming Asian film market Bruce now commanded, all funneled into a single broadcast. From a purely commercial standpoint, it was closer to a perfect idea than anything either man had actually asked for. The promoters, according to the story, moved fast once the initial interest came back non-negative from both sides. They started shaping the language of it before either fighter had agreed to a single detail, drafting broadcast rights, sketching out venue capacity, even, if you believe the more colorful retellings, sounding out choreographers and referees who'd know how to stage something that read as dangerous without either man actually getting seriously hurt. This is the part of the legend where the story stops being about two men who admired each other and starts being about an industry that had learned correctly that admiration between two famous men is itself a product, one that sells better than almost anything else you can put on a marquee. Here's a perspective worth taking for a second. From where the promoters sat, none of the private history mattered at all. The years of study, the notebook full of footwork diagrams, Bruce's honest admission to himself about the physics of size, none of that showed up anywhere in a contract. What showed up in the contract was two names, a date, a gate, and a percentage split. The story these men were selling wasn't the true one. It was a louder, simpler one built to move tickets, the age-old alchemy of turning something private into something everyone could buy a piece of. A quiet stretch here on both sides of this, worth just sitting inside for a moment before the story moves again. Picture Ollie somewhere in a hotel room between training sessions, a contract draft sitting on the nightstand that he hasn't signed and hasn't torn up either, the kind of document a man leaves out precisely, because looking at it occasionally feels like doing something about it without actually doing anything at all. And picture Bruce on the other side of the ocean in an office with film canisters still on the shelf, a similar draft in front of him, a pen he keeps picking up and setting back down. Neither man, if the story is honest with itself, was thrilled about what this had become. Ollie had spent his whole career being packaged, sold, marketed by men who profited off a persona he'd built himself and never fully owned the commercial rights to. And there's reason to think, based on how guarded he'd grown about his own image by this point in his life, that he recognized this offer for exactly what it was. Another cage built out of dollar signs, gorgeous from the outside. Still a cage. And Bruce, who'd spent years fighting Hollywood executives just to be allowed to play a lead role as something other than a stereotype, understood better than almost anyone alive what it felt like to have your own body turned into someone else's product before you'd agreed to any of the terms. That's the quiet, unglamorous truth sitting underneath all the excitement of a $2.5 million offer. The men at the center of it were, by most tellings, less excited than everyone circling them, which tells you something if you're paying attention. The people who wanted this fight the most were, almost without exception, the people who weren't going to be the ones standing in the ring. But there's one thing nobody had accounted for, which is exactly the kind of thing that always gets left off a contract. The moment a private idea gets whispered about in public, it stops belonging to the people who had it. Word leaked, The way word about anything this good always leaks. First as a line in a gossip column that nobody at either camp would confirm or deny, then as a slightly more confident rumor in a fight magazine. Then within a matter of weeks, as something reporters on 2 continents were calling both camps directly to ask about. Is it true? Is it happening? When? Where? How much? The questions arrived faster than either man had time to actually decide anything. And that, more than the money, more than the promoters, is what really changed the shape of the thing. Because once the public believes something is close to happening, the public starts owning a piece of the decision, whether either man invited it or not. Fans in Los Angeles started placing informal bets on the outcome in barbershops and pool halls. Hong Kong newspapers ran speculative illustrations of the 2 men squared off, poses invented entirely by an artist who'd clearly never seen either man's actual stance. Sports commentators who'd never once discussed martial arts on air were suddenly asked, on camera, whether a 140-pound movie star could survive 30 seconds against a heavyweight champion, and most of them, predictably, said no, loudly, with the specific confidence of men who'd never had to test the theory themselves. People who worked the film press circuit in Hong Kong that year still describe the specific flavor of that frenzy when the subject comes up, usually somewhere near the end of a long interview, almost as an afterthought. They remember editors demanding a comment from Bruce's camp every time a rival publication ran even a speculative paragraph about the fight, and they remember the same non-answer coming back each time. Polite, vague, giving nothing away. They remember a rumor, impossible to pin to any single source, that a Los Angeles radio station ran an entire hour of callers debating the matchup as though it had already been scheduled for a specific date, a date that, as far as anyone could determine now, never actually existed on any calendar belonging to either man. Nobody who tells this part of the story claims to have been standing in the room for the calls that mattered. What they agree on, uniformly, is the volume of it, the sense that a private curiosity between 2 men had, within a matter of weeks, become public property that neither man had ever signed away. That's the strange mechanics of fame working exactly as they always do. And it's worth pausing on because it's the least mythical, most believable part of this entire chapter. You don't need a projector, a shadow, or a secret letter to explain any of it. You just need 2 extremely famous men and a rumor with just enough plausibility to survive a single retelling. After that, it runs on its own fuel. That's the factor nobody in that original consortium meeting had bothered to price in. Once this stopped being a private negotiation between 2 camps and became a public argument happening in barbershops and newsrooms on opposite sides of the planet, the pressure on both men to actually answer the question, publicly, decisively, one way or the other, multiplied past anything a contract clause could contain. Silence, which might have been the easiest and safest answer a month earlier, was no longer available to either of them. Everyone wanted a verdict, and a verdict, eventually, is exactly what one of them decided to give. It's late in the year now. The story places it right around the time Bruce was deep in preparation for what would become his most ambitious film yet. Splitting his attention between choreography he was designing himself and a decision he kept putting off past every deadline the promoters gently, then less gently, kept reminding him about. Here's what I think was actually happening in that stretch, reading between everything we know for certain about how Bruce operated. He wasn't stalling out of fear of the fight itself. We already know, because he'd said it plainly to people close to him, that he understood exactly what a real heavyweight encounter would and wouldn't do for him physically. Fear of losing wasn't the obstacle. Something quieter was. By every account of the people around him at the time, Bruce had grown increasingly uneasy with what this whole affair had become versus what it had started as. It had started, in his own private study, as something close to reverence, a serious artist learning from another serious artist across a gap of sport and background that didn't matter half as much as people assumed. Somewhere between the promoters and the newspaper illustrations and the barbershop odds-making, That reverence had been repackaged into a spectacle with his name and Ali's name stamped on it like product labels, sold to an audience that had no idea what either man had actually spent years quietly working toward. Ali, for his part, was dealing with his own version of the same discomfort, compounded by everything else pulling at him that year: his comeback, the ongoing fallout from his years in exile, a public image he was still actively rebuilding fight by fight. Neither man, by most tellings, ever spoke to the other directly during this entire stretch. No phone call, no telegram. Whatever was building between them was still, entirely, a conversation happening through intermediaries, through contracts, through rumor, through the strange second-hand echo of two men who admired each other's work without ever once hearing the other man's actual voice. And it was into that silence, with a deadline from the promoters finally forcing his hand, that Bruce Lee sat down and started to write. Not a signature on a contract, something else entirely. Maybe it happened exactly like this. Maybe it didn't happen at all, not on paper, not in these words. I can't hand you the original page, and anyone who tells you they've seen it is telling you more than the honest record supports. What survives is the shape of it, passed down the way the best parts of this story always get passed down, secondhand, worn smooth by retelling, and still, somehow, carrying the exact weight it needs to. Everyone expected one of two answers out of Bruce. Either a yes, dressed up in whatever confident language his public persona demanded, agreeing to step into that ring and prove, on camera, in front of the whole world, that size didn't matter against skill. Or a no, some careful, face-saving version of no, citing scheduling, citing his film commitments, the kind of graceful decline that lets everyone walk away pretending the offer was simply mistimed rather than admitting anyone had genuinely hesitated. Bruce gave neither. What he apparently wrote instead, addressed to Ali directly rather than to the promoters circling both of them, was a kind of proposal nobody in that entire arrangement had thought to make. Not an exhibition, not about, sanctioned or otherwise, not a broadcast, not a gate split, not a single camera in the building. Just the two of them in a room on their own time with nobody watching and nobody profiting, meeting the way two serious students of movement meet when the only thing on the table is the work itself. He wanted, the story says, to show Ali in person some of what he'd built out of studying him from a distance, and to ask Ali, plainly, human to human, whether any of it had ever traveled the other way, whether any of what Bruce had heard about a projector clicking away in a dark room had a shred of truth in it at all. Here's what gets me about this version of the story, assuming even half of it holds up. It isn't the answer of a man protecting his reputation. A carefully worded decline protects a reputation. A vague yes with an exit clause buried in the fine print protects a reputation. What Bruce apparently wrote instead protected something else entirely, something with no commercial value whatsoever, which is exactly why nobody selling tickets would have wanted it. The actual private thing that had drawn these two men toward each other in the first place, before promoters, before newspapers, before $2.5 million, turned it into a product with a date and a venue attached. Think about what that answer actually does to the shape of this whole story. It takes the biggest spectacle either man's career had ever been offered and quietly, deliberately, shrinks it back down to the size it started at. Two men, a shared curiosity, and nothing else riding on it. That's not the answer a promoter can sell. That's not even the answer most audiences, then or now, particularly want to hear, because it doesn't come with a winner. But it might be the only answer that was ever actually true to who both of these men were underneath the noise everyone else had built around them. Whether Ali ever read a word of it is, and I promise I'm not dodging this to be coy, a genuinely open question. What isn't in dispute, at least in how this story has been carried forward, is that the letter, in whatever form it actually took, never once reached the promoter's desk and never became part of any contract, and never, as far as anyone has ever been able to confirm, got sent anywhere at all. Picture the promoter's side of this for a second, because their confusion is almost its own small comedy sitting inside a much bigger story. These were men who understood exactly one language, the language of dates, gates, and signatures. And what came back for Bruce's camp instead was something that didn't fit any line item on any contract they knew how to draft. No firm yes. No clean no. Just a private overture to the other fighter that bypassed the entire commercial apparatus they'd spent months building around this idea. By most tellings, at least one promoter tried, more than once, to get Bruce to reconsider, to formalize something, anything that could be sold the way the original offer had been sold. Reportedly, he was told, gently but with total finality, that if a meeting between the two men ever happened, it wouldn't be one either promoter had a hand in arranging, and it wouldn't have a ticket price attached. That answer, unsurprisingly, satisfied absolutely nobody whose income depended on this becoming a spectacle. And within a matter of weeks, the entire deal, the $2.5 million, the broadcast rights, the venue that had reportedly already been floated, quietly stopped being discussed in any serious way at all. Look at it from Ali's side of this for a moment, because his half of the silence is, if anything, even harder to pin down than Bruce's. There's no clear record of Ali ever publicly acknowledging that any formal exhibition offer existed at all, which cuts two ways depending on how generous you want to be. It could mean the whole thing never got as far as his desk in any serious form. It could just as easily mean Ali, a man who understood image and leverage better than almost anyone in sports history, chose deliberately not to comment on something that hadn't panned out. The same instinct that made him famous for never once admitting a strategy hadn't worked when he could instead let the silence do something more interesting. Either explanation fits everything we actually know about him. Neither one is provable. What we're left with, then, is two men who never spoke a public word to each other about any of this on either end before or after. An offer that came close enough to real money and real contracts that people who were adults at the time still argue about how close it actually got. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, a piece of paper written in one man's hand, addressed to the other, that by every account that survives, never once left the building it was written in. That's the part of this story that should bother you a little. It bothers me. Because a man who goes to the trouble of writing something that honest, that personal, doesn't usually just leave in a drawer for no reason at all. There's always a reason. And the version of this story people love to tell, the lazy version, the version that gets repeated by people who stop thinking about it, is that Bruce got cold feet. That somewhere between the pen and the envelope, he looked at the size difference one more time and quietly decided the smart move was to let the whole thing die on its own. I don't buy that version, and I don't think, if you stay with me another few minutes, you will either. That's who he was to the promoters, a man who wouldn't sign. Here's who he was underneath that, if the more careful tellings of this story are worth anything at all. Bruce Lee did not spend years of quiet, unpaid, unwatched study on Muhammad Ali's footwork because he was afraid of the man. Fear doesn't rewind a reel 9 times looking for the exact frame where a hip commits before a fist does. What Bruce built toward Ali, across all that private film and all those notebook pages, was something the promoter's contract couldn't even find a line for because it wasn't a commercial category. It was respect, the specific wordless kind that exists between two people who've never met, but who each recognize, watching the other work, that they're looking at somebody operating on their own level, maybe the only other person alive operating on their own level. Here's the thing about that particular kind of respect. It's rare. It survives almost entirely on the fact that nobody else gets to touch it. The moment a promoter, a network, a gate receipt, or a betting line gets involved, the thing stops being between the two men and starts being between two brands, two properties, two assets that a room full of businessmen have already priced out to the dollar. Bruce, more than almost anyone in his position, understood exactly how that transformation works, because he'd watched it happen to his own image his entire career, Watch studios try to flatten him into a marketable idea instead of an actual person doing actual work. I think, and this is me telling you plainly that this is interpretation, not fact, that Bruce looked at that contract at the $2.5 million, at the choreographers being quietly consulted, at the venue capacity already being floated before either man had agreed to a single detail and recognized precisely what it would cost. Not physically, not in some story about a punch he couldn't survive. It would cost the only thing about this whole strange, silent relationship that was actually his, the fact that it had never once been for sale. So he wrote the other version instead, the private one. No cameras, no gate, no winner declared at the end of the night. Just two men in a room comparing notes on a shared obsession neither one had ever gotten to discuss with someone who actually understood it. And then, having written it, having put into words the single most honest thing he probably could have said to Muhammad Ali, he apparently looked at it again and made a second decision even harder than the first. He didn't send it either. Not, as far as this story is willing to claim, out of fear that Ali would say no. Not out of some sudden cold feet about the size and reach we already know he'd made peace with years earlier. If the more thoughtful version of this legend holds any water at all, Bruce held that letter back because he understood something else, something almost too quiet to say out loud, without sounding like he was talking himself out of the very thing he wanted most. That even a private meeting, even one with no cameras and no gate, existing only because two famous men had agreed to it, would eventually become public the moment either man mentioned it to anyone at all. Fame doesn't allow for truly private rooms, not for men at that altitude. The moment word got out that Bruce Lee and Muhammad Ali had quietly met, alone, to compare notes, the story would write itself into exactly the spectacle he'd just spent weeks refusing to sign up for, just without the money attached this time. Maybe the only way to actually protect the thing he valued, the years of private study, the unspoken mutual respect, the fact that neither man had ever needed the other's validation to know his own worth, was to never test it against reality at all. Some things survive precisely because they stay theoretical. The moment you make them real, you also make them finite, capable of disappointing you, capable of ending. A letter unsent can mean anything. A letter sent, read, and answered can only ever mean one specific thing. And there was a real chance, however small, that the specific thing would be smaller than the myth. That's the choice, if this version of the story is even half true. Not fear of losing. Fear, if it's fear at all, of shrinking something rare down to a size where it could be bought, sold, judged, and eventually forgotten, the way most exhibitions eventually are. So what happened to the letter? That's the question every version of this story eventually runs into. And I'll tell you plainly, the same way I've told you everything else tonight, I don't have an answer for you. Nobody does, not honestly. The tellings scatter here in 3 or 4 different directions, depending on who's doing the telling. One version has it staying in a drawer in that Hong Kong office until it was lost in the general churn of a life that ended far too soon and far too fast. Another version, the one that gets whispered rather than stated, claims Bruce did eventually hand it to someone, a go-between, a mutual acquaintance with a foot in both the fight world and the film world, with instructions that were never fully carried out. A third version, the one I find least believable and most romantic, has the letter reaching Ali's camp after all, quietly, without fanfare, read by Ali alone, and never once mentioned publicly by a man who, whatever else you want to say about him, absolutely knew how to keep a secret when keeping it served him. I'm not going to pretend I know which of those, if any, is true. I don't. Nobody currently telling this story does either, no matter how confidently they say otherwise. What I can tell you is that no version of this letter has ever surfaced publicly. No auction house has sold it. No biographer has produced it. No family member on either side has ever gone on record describing its exact contents. It exists, if it exists at all, entirely in the second-hand telling, which is either the most frustrating detail in this whole story or the most fitting one, depending on how you feel about mysteries that refuse to resolve on schedule. Here's a number worth sitting with for a second. 0. That's how many confirmed sightings of that letter exist anywhere, in any archive, in any collection, in any single interview where someone credible says plainly, "I have seen this with my own eyes." 0. Across 60 years of people telling this story like it's gospel. And maybe that's exactly the point. Maybe a story this good was never going to end with a document under glass in a museum somewhere, dated and authenticated and drained of every bit of mystery that made it worth telling in the first place. Some legends need the missing piece to stay missing. The moment you find it, you don't get a better story. You just get an answer, and answers, however satisfying, are a different animal from wonder entirely. I'll say this much, and then I'll leave it alone, at least for tonight. If that letter is out there somewhere, in a box, in an estate, in the hands of someone who has no idea what they're actually holding, that's a thread worth pulling on. Not tonight. Tonight isn't where that thread gets pulled. But keep it in the back of your mind, because it's not one I'm done with. 2 weeks pass, then a month, then most of a year, and the offer that once had lawyers drafting language on 2 continents simply stops being mentioned anywhere at all. No formal announcement that it was dead. No press conference explaining why. It just quietly stopped existing the way a lot of things that once felt inevitable eventually do, replaced in every newspaper and every conversation by whatever the next inevitable thing turned out to be. But here's the part of this story that actually outlives the offer, the promoters, and every barbershop argument about who would have one. Neither man needed the fight to happen for the other man's influence to show up in what he built next. Look at what Bruce spent his final years developing, right up through the film that would become his global breakthrough and the one that would come out after he was already gone. Jeet Kune, as a philosophy, was built explicitly around economy of motion, around not committing more force or more structure to a movement than the situation actually required, around footwork that prized angle and timing over raw aggression. That entire framework owes a documented, acknowledged debt to hours spent with a boxer's footage, hours Bruce talked about openly while he was alive. Every student who ever trained under that system, every martial artist since who has studied his approach to distance and angle, has inherited a piece of what Bruce pulled, frame by frame, out of watching Muhammad Ali move. And look at what happened to Ali himself in the years after this offer quietly died. He kept fighting for another decade, through wars against Frazier and Foreman that live on as some of the greatest theater the sport has ever produced, his footwork continuing to evolve in ways that occasionally puzzled commentators who couldn't always explain where the newer wrinkles had come from. I won't stand here and tell you Bruce Lee is the reason for any specific adjustment in Ali's later fights, because I don't know that, and neither does anyone else currently telling this story with a straight face. But I'll tell you this much plainly. A man that curious, that magpie-minded about anything that moved beautifully, doesn't spend real hours with another master's film and walk away having taken nothing at all. Here's the saddest arithmetic in this whole story, and I don't think there's a way to tell it without sitting with it for a second. Bruce Lee died in 1973, 32 years old, sudden and shocking, the letter still unsent, the meeting still unmet, whatever he and Ali actually understood about each other locked forever at exactly the level it had reached the day he wrote it. Ali went on for decades after that, through triumph and decline both, carrying whatever he'd taken from those film reels quietly inside a body and a mind that the world watched slow down in painfully public fashion. 2 men who moved better than almost anyone alive in their century, and only one of them got the decades everyone assumes they're owed. That's the myth doing its work again, if I'm honest with you. Not lying. Just doing what myths do, taking a real, unfinished, achingly human situation, 2 men who ran out of time to become what they might have become to each other, and turning it into something that feels, against all reason, like it was always meant to end exactly this way. I don't think it was meant to end any particular way. I think two remarkable men admired each other from a distance, ran out of the right circumstances to close that distance, and left behind just enough trace of each other in their own work that anyone paying close attention can still see it. That's not a tragedy dressed up as fate. It's just what happens, more often than any of us like to admit, between people who respect each other and never quite find a moment. That's who they were to the world. Two icons circling each other at a distance the public could only ever guess at. Here's who I think they actually were underneath that, and it's worth separating the two before we go any further. Take away the poster-sized version of both men for a second, the unbeatable movie hero, the loudest mouth in sports history, and what's left is oddly similar in both cases. A young man from an unglamorous background who worked obsessively, privately, past the point most people would call reasonable, to become the best that had ever done the specific thing he did. Bruce grew up scrawny and picked on in Hong Kong before he built the body and the system that made him legendary. Ollie grew up in segregated Louisville before he built the mouth and the footwork that made him unbeatable in the ring and eventually unbeatable in the court of public opinion too, on his own terms, at enormous personal cost. Neither man arrived as the myth. Both men built the myth brick by brick out of exactly the kind of unglamorous, unwatched labor we've spent this whole story describing. Footage rewound at midnight, a bigger training partner absorbing angle after angle in an empty room. That similarity, more than the footwork itself, might be the real reason these two were drawn to each other's work in the first place. Not because a punch resembled a jab or a pivot resembled shuffle, because each one, looking at the other, was looking at a mirror of his own private discipline, the invisible part of greatness that audiences never actually get to see and mostly don't care to. Fans want the finished performance. These two men, each in his own separate room, wanted the machinery underneath it. Almost certainly, if you pressed either of them at the time and asked them to explain it in exactly these terms, neither one would have described it so neatly. Ollie would probably have made a joke of it, the way he made a joke of most things that got too close to sincerity in public. Bruce would probably have folded it into some technical explanation about range and timing before he let it get too personal on camera. But privately, in the actual rooms where the actual work happened, I don't think either man needed it explained. I think they both already knew exactly what they were looking at in the other, which is precisely why neither of them ever needed the fight itself to happen to feel like something real had already passed between them. It's decades later now, and this story is still being told. In gyms, in comment sections, in exactly the kind of late-night conversation where somebody brings up the idea of Bruce Lee and Muhammad Ali in the same sentence and watches the whole room lean in a little. That, on its own, tells you something worth noticing. Stories that were never true don't usually survive 60 years of scrutiny from people who genuinely want to find the receipts. Stories that were entirely true don't usually stay this stubbornly undocumented either. No photograph, no signed letter, no single eyewitness willing to put their name on the record. This one lives in the narrow, uncomfortable space between those two extremes. And I think that space is exactly why it refuses to die. Somewhere out there, in an archive nobody has fully cataloged, or a private collection somebody's grandchildren haven't gotten around to sorting through, or nowhere at all, in which case this entire chapter of the legend simply stays a legend forever. There may or may not be a page in Bruce Lee's own handwriting addressed to a heavyweight champion he never met. I've told you plainly I don't know. Anyone who tells you they do know is selling you something. What I do know is that the not knowing is doing exactly what it's always done for this particular story. Keeping two remarkable men just close enough to each other across all this time that we're still, right now, imagining the room they never actually shared. I'll be honest with you one more time before we close this chapter of it out. Somewhere down the line, I want to come back to this specific thread, the letter, its fate, whatever thin, disputed trail of paper or memory might still exist connecting these two men beyond what we've covered tonight. Not tonight, though. Tonight was about how two separate obsessions built toward each other without ever quite touching. What happened to the one physical object that might prove any of it? That's a different story for a different night, and I'm not going to pretend I can tell it to you before I've actually gone looking myself. Let yourself picture it anyway, just for a moment, the way I have more times than I probably should admit. Not as fact, as the image the whole legend has been quietly building toward this entire time. A gym somewhere between the two men's worlds, neutral ground, the kind of room that could exist in Los Angeles or Hong Kong, or nowhere at all, empty except for the two of them and whatever handful of people they'd each trusted enough to bring along. No cameras, because that was always the one condition neither man would have broken. Ollie, filling the doorway the way he filled every doorway he ever stood in, sizing up a man he'd apparently spent private hours studying one frame at a time. Bruce, half his size and twice as still, watching the same way he watched everything, cataloging already 3 moves into a conversation that hadn't started yet. Maybe they shake hands first, the way careful men who respect each other always do before anything else happens. Maybe Ollie says something enormous and funny to cut the tension, because that's what Ollie did in every room he ever walked into. And maybe Bruce, for once, doesn't try to match him for volume, just lets the joke land and answers with something quieter that somehow lands harder. Maybe they trade one motion each, not a fight, nothing that could be scored or bet on, just two students showing each other, finally, in person, the exact thing they'd each been chasing alone in separate rooms for years. A hip turn, an angle off the line, the 3 seconds of film worn thin from rewinding, finally standing up and shaking a real hand. I don't know if any version of that afternoon ever actually happened. The honest, responsible answer, the one I'd give you even if it cost me the ending you wanted, is that it almost certainly didn't, not like this, maybe not at all. But I think the reason this particular image refuses to leave people's heads, the reason it survived 60 years of retelling by people who have no actual stake in whether it's true, is that it captures something neither man ever got to say out loud to the other while he had the chance. That respect like this doesn't need an audience to be real. It just needs 2 people who see it in each other, and the good sense, rare as it is, to leave it exactly where it lives. So let me leave you with the actual shape of what we've got, because you've earned a straight accounting after sitting through all of it with me. So, how much of that actually happened? Honestly, almost none of it, at least not in the specific cinematic form I've told it to you tonight. This is a legend, a story I tell, dramatized and largely imagined, built around the real Bruce Lee rather than a documented record of him. There was no projector clicking away in a dark room, with Ali's shadow throwing Bruce's own punch back at the wall, not that anyone has ever put on film or in writing. There is no surviving copy of a letter, no confirmed offer for $2.5 million, no promoter's contract sitting in an archive with both men's names on it, and if any of those things did exist in some form, nobody has ever produced them for anyone to examine. Big Wilson, the training partner, is a name and a build I gave to a role that likely stood in for several different people over several different sessions, if it happened in any of the specific ways I described it at all. The scene where Ollie in his corner supposedly noticed a stolen bit of footwork, the imagined afternoon in a neutral gym where 2 hands finally meet, all of that lives entirely in the space where legend does its best work, which is to say nowhere you could ever actually stand and point to. What's real, and I want to be just as clear about this half of it, is that Bruce Lee genuinely, documentedly, spent real hours of his short life studying Muhammad Ali's fight footage, frame by frame, specifically for the footwork and the ring generalship, and that he spoke about this himself, openly, while he was alive. That admiration flowed into Jeet Kune in ways his own students still teach today. That both men lived through this exact stretch of years, 1970 and in 1971, each becoming something close to the most famous version of themselves at almost the same moment, an ocean apart, without ever meeting. Whatever quiet, invisible thread ran between them beyond that one confirmed fact is the part one can't hand you a receipt for. I don't have one. I don't think anyone alive does. Here's what gets me, one last time before I let you go. It would have been so easy for this to end in confirmation. A photograph turning up. A grainy home movie of the two of them shaking hands in a gym nobody remembers the address of anymore. That's the ending most stories like this one eventually manufacture for themselves, because audiences like resolution, and resolution sells better than a shrug. I don't have that ending for you, and honestly, I'm not sure I'd want to, even if somebody handed it to me tomorrow. Some things are more true as an open question than they'd ever be as a closed one. Two men who never met spent years thinking about each other anyway, in separate rooms, on separate continents. Each one convinced, in his own private way, that the other had found something worth stealing. Neither one needed the world to watch that admiration to know it was real. Neither one needed a belt or a scoreboard to settle it, because there was never actually anything to settle, just two extraordinary people quietly making each other better from a distance, neither one ever fully closed. Maybe that's smaller than the fight everyone wanted. I've come to think it's bigger. I can't prove the projector. I can't prove the letter. But two men who respected each other enough to study each other in silence for years, and enough to walk away from $2.5 million rather than let that silence get bought and sold. That part, I'd bet my life, is real. Some men become legends because of what they did. Bruce became one because of what he chose not to do. Until the next legend. If this one got you, there are more legends where this came from. Subscribe, and I'll keep telling them.